The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales Radio Show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Weird Tales Radio Show with me, Charles Christian. Thank you so much for tuning in again. Coming later in this show, we have an interview with the American author Morgan Daimler about the Fae, that's the fairy folk and Irish folklore. But first, let's have a look at a really cheery topic, namely death by selfie. And yes, it really is a thing. According to a study in the Journal of Family Medicine and Primary Care, it was published in 2018, between October 2011 and November 2017, there were a total of 259 selfie deaths around the world. The highest occurrences were in India, followed by Russia, the United States and Pakistan. The average age of the victim was 23 years old, and males outnumbered female deaths by 3-1. So basically, stupid young men. Mind you, the true figure may be much higher, as the US Department of Transportation estimated way back in 2014 that 33,000 American citizens were injured each year while driving and using a mobile phone. True, this obviously includes all those cases where people lose concentration or are distracted while answering or making calls. But coincidentally, that same year, a US insurance company conducted a survey which found that 4% of drivers admitted to taking selfies while driving. Now, 4% might not sound much, but in that 33,000 figure alone, that's a possible 1,300 selfie-related injuries. Back to the deaths. The most frequent causes of death include drowning, caused by people posing on beaches and being swept away by waves, or else falling down banks into rivers and lakes, or falling off cliffs into the sea. Then there are falls off bridges, tall buildings, mountains, anywhere like that. And we have the sad tale here of Korean student Hye-won Kim. She was taking selfies on the Seven Sisters Cliffs near Beachy Head in Sussex and fell to her death. Her body was found at the foot of the cliffs, and when they examined the phone, they found photographs of her jumping up in the air very close to the cliff edge while taking the pictures. So sadly, she jumped up and didn't quite come down where the land still was. Electrocution, often caused by people climbing on trains and accidentally touching overhead cables, is another major cause of deaths. And transport, obviously taking selfies in cars and on bicycles, but trains are a major cause of death, particularly in India, where rail transport is so prevalent. Getting hit by a train coming in the opposite direction while hanging out of a window trying to take a selfie is a frequent occurrence, as is standing on the tracks with a train approaching you from behind while waiting for that perfect moment to take a dangerous selfie. Yeah, you do know it takes time for a train to come to a standing halt, by which time you've been flattened. Firearms, yes, people really do take selfies of themselves holding guns to the head and accidentally pull the trigger while pushing the button to take the selfie shot. I know, at least they could unload the darn things first. And then there are all those selfies with dangerous animals in the background. In fact, the US Forestry Service has had to issue warnings about getting too close to bears and bison. They may look like big furry chumps, but they can run fast. Certainly faster than you can run away from them. It's a sad fact that back in the final quarter of the last century, which is a rather melodramatic way of saying, from about 1975 onwards, various locations around the world, mountain peaks, tops of high buildings, bridges, cliff tops, were having to be fenced off to prevent access because they'd become suicide hotspots destinations to which people would travel if they were intent on killing themselves. Whereas now hazardous beauty spots, mountains, tops of high buildings, bridges, cliff tops, are having to be designated no selfie zones because people are accidentally getting themselves killed there while taking selfies. Instagramicide, I suppose you could call it. But wait, you say, surely the restrictions on international travel in the wake of the coronavirus lockdowns have improved matters. Nope, because in April, the 30th, not the 1st, in case you're wondering, a 30-year-old student from Kazakhstan fell down a 115-foot high cliff in city of Antalya in Turkey while trying to take a selfie with a waterfall in the picture. And he was there on holiday celebrating the lift down of the coronavirus lockdown in the city. Yeah, sort of irony upon irony. Right, let's get on with our interview. And in the hot seat today is the American author Morgan Daimler. Morgan is the author of more than 24 books on subjects relating to Irish mythology, paganism and fairies. She also writes urban fantasy, paranormal, romance fiction, and is even, as she puts it, an amateur translator of Old Irish. She was a lovely person to interview. However, before we started, she did warn me that every time she's conducted a radio interview about the fairy folk, or the good people as Morgan prefers to call them, there have been technical problems. And so it proved with our interview, as firstly the two of us couldn't establish a connection, then about halfway through the interview the connection failed, and then when we finally established a link, my recording system temporarily stopped recording. And that's not including the moments when Morgan's voice distorts into some kind of demonic vocal fry. The break comes in the section where we're discussing Bridget, the Irish pagan goddess, or perhaps saint. Anyway, just before we get going, you can find Morgan on Twitter at Morgan Daimler, and links to all her books on Amazon.com. It's my great pleasure now to be talking to Morgan Daimler. Hello, Morgan.
Hello, it's a great pleasure to be here.
Well, in these times of coronavirus, it is a great pleasure to be anywhere.
That's very true. Yes.
Now, we're going to talk about your books and your interest. But first thing, we're looking at folklore surrounding the fae or fairies and paganism and the like. What got you interested in this?
That's an excellent question. And yes, very, very broad topics there. Well, I'm in the United States, of course. I'm sure you can tell from my accent. But I'm part of the Irish American diaspora. My grandfather was from Ireland. And so even being over here, I had grown up with, some of the beliefs relating to the fair folk. And I think even, from childhood, that just really had me very interested in it. And it was always something that I believed in. So then as I got older, I started really researching it and reading about it and looking for other people's experiences and other people's stories, and then just as I got older, it sort of became a passion. So, yeah. And that's where I am today.
That's where you are today. Yeah. Yes, and you've written a number of books. I've got one of your book pages up on John Hunt Publishing. Yes. You've written a number of non-fiction books, but you also write urban fantasy and paranormal romance fiction as well.
I do, yes. Also with Irish mythology and fairy lore themes in the fiction. It's sort of everywhere.
Yeah. Right. Now, one of the books you've got coming along later this year is your second book on Morrigan, the Raven Goddess. Now, yes. She's a fascinating being and underlies so much not just Irish, but also, if you like, pagan folklore. What got you interested with her?
That's another very, very good question. I wasn't raised Christian. I sort of came to paganism when I was in my preteens. And because I had that sort of Irish American background, I was sort of drawn from the beginning to Irish mythology and Irish deities. And, as I got into my 20s in particular, I started to be really fascinated with the Morrigan because I think initially she drew my interest because she kind of had a bad reputation at that point.
Scary reputation as well.
Yes. This would have been the late 90s, the early 2000s. And most books at that point, if you picked them up, would say things like just avoid her, do not engage. And I think that sort of got me interested in why, what was actually going on there. And, then the more you learn about her and the more you see really what a major role she played in the mythology and how essential she was in a lot of places, and that her sort of bad reputation, if you will, is often a misunderstanding, I think, of what she really is and does, and particularly taken out of the context of the culture at the time the stories were being recorded. And I found it all very fascinating. So.
Yeah, because one of the aspects of her is that she's possibly a triple goddess, isn't she?
Yeah, she's very strongly associated with two other goddesses who are her sisters, Baive and Macha. And they're often referred to as the three Morrigans, on Sri Morigna. And they sort of, in quite a bit of the mythology, go around together as this group of three and act together. And, it's interesting when you look at Irish mythology in general, the most important deities, whether gods or goddesses, are usually in groups of three or triplicates in some way. So that's another hint actually to how important she was originally, and possibly still.
Yeah.
But
yeah, but you're saying she's not quite the, because she's also known as the crow goddess, isn't she? And the sort of battle goddess. And
yes.
You see lots of depictions of her standing on a blooded battlefield with corpses all around and crows all around. And
yes. Yeah, I think it's easy to understand why those images capture the imagination and why they're so popular. And she certainly does have those associations with battle. It's actually one of the most interesting things to me is that the Irish and more generally Celtic language-speaking cultures tend to have war goddesses instead of war gods, or the war gods that we find are not as major figures as the war goddesses are, which is very different from what we see in a lot of the continental cultures. Yes. And yeah, she's very strongly associated with crows and ravens. In the mythology, she's known to shapeshift and appear as those birds. So yeah, very, very interesting stuff.
Let's talk a little bit more about them. What is your take on what fairies actually are? Are they, there's a whole range of possibilities, but are they some kind of little people? Are they supernatural beings? Are they beings that exist in a slightly different dimension to us, and that our paths, our world and the other world, if you like, occasionally cross and we encounter them? Or are they all just figments of somebody's imagination from, a sort of a 2,000-year-old version of Harry Potter or somebody. Somebody said, this is a good tale. What's your take on it?
Well, I think the short answer is yes. Everything you just said, which is another thing that I love about the subject, is that it's so nuanced and complex. I think the more detailed answer is that when we look across the breadth of the folklore and into the mythology, they appear to be otherworldly beings, a various assortment of types of beings who come from another world. And there's multitude of ways to understand, that particular concept, but that come into this world and interact with people in this world in various ways, sometimes beneficially and sometimes definitely not beneficially for the human involved. And I think when we look across all of that, we end up really, in defining the word fairy, being left with such a broad category that honestly everything you just said in your initial questions does apply. I do think sometimes they are just people's imaginations, people's wishful thinking, a good story, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that there are genuine encounters people have that have no other explanation. Things that really fall outside of what we would term, the normal reality. I think the fact that they've so persistently existed across cultures and across mythology, across folklore, even into the modern day, people still tell stories of them, still claim to have experiences with them, encounters with them, speaks to something deeper going on than necessarily just a good story. But they certainly are that too, so...
Yes, because in Ireland, people still take the idea of fairy roads seriously. You don't build a new housing estate in the middle of a traditional where a fairy road is believed to come down, mm-hmm. And it crops up in the press from time to time where a development's been rooted in a slightly different way because it was felt that it would perhaps upset the little people in the way it went. And
Yep, we actually see that in Iceland as well.
Yes.
I was in Iceland a few years ago, and it's very similar in the sense that if you ask people, just people that you would run into on the street, if they believe in Iceland they're called alfar or huldafolk. Most of them are going to say no. Of course they don't believe in them, but you don't offend them.
Yes.
You don't go certain places. You don't build roads where there's a Alfakirche is the word, an elf church, which is sort of the stone equivalent to the fairy trees that we see in Ireland. Mm-hmm. There's a story from Iceland from, I believe it was 4 or 5 years ago, of a mining company that was digging a well that started having all sorts of problems, and they came to believe that the spot they were digging in belonged to the elves. And so they stopped and moved locations. So it is a very strong belief still in many places.
Yeah. And you just touched on a point there that's always intrigued me as well, is the interchangeability of elves and fairies. And indeed, mm-hmm. certainly in English literature, the two terms were synonymous until relatively recently, the fairy queen and the queen of Elfland and so on. Mm-hmm. And it's really... certainly from the English perspective, was a sort of Victorians who came up with the current rather twee fairies with the little tiny beings with little wings on them flitting about.
Yes, the Victorians have much to answer for.
Yeah, certainly in Irish history.
Yeah, they had a lot of impacts on culture that I don't think people always fully grasp. But yeah, there's been an interesting sort of bifurcating effect post-Victorian era, where you still have the more traditional fairy beliefs. You still have, places you can go where people believe in the fairies as beings who are potentially dangerous. You don't want to offend them. You don't want to interfere with things that belong to them. But then you have this sort of second stream of belief that's come into particularly mainstream popular culture because of the Victorians, and that very much is that twee sort of helpful sprite living at the bottom of the garden sort of view. And it's a fascinating contrast, because the older view is much grittier and darker in many cases than what the Victorians have left us with.
Yes, because I mean, if you go with the Scottish, where they have the Seelie court and the unseelie court, the unseelie court fairies are particularly hostile to humans, and the Seelie court aren't that much of a fan, but they're not quite so dangerous.
Right, and I think that's something that people, particularly outside of those areas, don't always understand, because those two terms, Seelie and unseelie, have kind of been taken into popular culture. You'll find it in a lot of fiction these days. Oh, yes. And very much redefined. But yes, when you look at the original meanings and the meanings that still exist within the culture, the idea that the unseelie really just dislike humanity and are the most likely to sort of maliciously interact with humans, as opposed to the Seelie, who can be helpful, but also you wouldn't want to offend them either, because they also don't take being insulted particularly well.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, the Seelie, I suppose, tolerate us, but that's about as far as it goes.
Yes, that would be a good way to put it.
Going back to the Irish mythology, because a lot of people, their natural, if they don't know sort of more of the background, their natural assumption is that the Irish, certainly in the Irish Republic, are all devout Catholics and stick with the Christianity, yet there's this strong interest in the otherworldly side of things with the Fae. But this really sort of comes to a point with Bridget, who's both a pagan deity and a Christian saint. How do you place her? Which one is there? I mean, we know the Christian Church was a great one for adopting local cultural themes, if you like, and we won't try and destroy this goddess. We'll make her out that she was a saint. What's your take on Bridget?
Yeah, I think we see a lot of syncretism going on where. If you look at the mythology that has to do with Briege the goddess, there's some people that feel that the saint was entirely fabricated from the older goddess. There's some people that feel the two figures are completely separate beings. I tend to believe, having looked fairly thoroughly into Bridget as both the goddess and then some of her overlapping stories that relate to the saint, that there's probably syncretism involved, that they most likely, as you had said initially posing the question, aspects of the goddess at least were taken and incorporated into the stories related to the saint, so that we see a lot of similarities between the two. We see certain things that Bridget is particularly known for, that the saint is also known for and connected to. And many people today, whatever the actual historic truth is, tend to treat them as either synonymous or strongly connected.
Because, I mean, there is one version that says she was a sort of druid priestess who then moved over and became a Christian.
Yeah, the layers are just fascinating. I'm going to try not to use the word fascinating too much today, but everything is so fascinating.
It is.
It is. In the original mythology with the goddess Bridget, her father is the Dagda, and one of his aspects in mythology connects to Druidism and the idea of being a Druid. And then the Christian version, there are stories of the Christian saint that say her father was a Druid. So things like that, they're just such strong echoes of each other. I think we can't entirely discount that.
Yeah. Now, we just had a break in communications, and you were saying whenever you've done a interview about the Fae, there's always a technical hitch.
Yes.
It does raise a point, does modern technology affect fairies, or do fairies affect modern technology?
I've never personally heard stories about modern technology affecting the good folk. I have, as I had shared with you after our little issue a moment ago, I have had multiple personal experiences with them, either tongue-in-cheek or more seriously affecting technology. And I've also heard stories from friends who were trying to do things like record videos and such at specific locations associated with the fair folk, who had their batteries drain and had other sort of interesting tech issues crop up. So I'm inclined to say that they certainly seem to be able to influence or affect human technology. I don't know if that goes the other way, though.
Yes. And what about some of the more recent, we're heading more into urban legend type territory, stories about the Fae? I mean, what about, there's a suggestion, I've heard that black-eyed children may be have some kind of Fae connection, if you accept that black-eyed children exist and are, not purely a creepypasta invention.
Yes. And there's a whole interesting conversation we could have, even just around if they were originally a whole creepypasta invention and now have become an actual phenomena, how that process might play out when it comes to the fairies. This is something that's been coming up quite a bit recently. I think partially because the black-eyed children are gaining more popularity or renown. But I do think the question of how much are certain cryptids or how much are certain urban folklore, if you will, kind of playing into modern fairy lore. And there definitely is a strong crossover. The black-eyed children are so new as a phenomena that there's so many competing theories as to what they can be. I've heard people advocate that they could be aliens. I have certainly heard it put forth that they're some sort of human ghost or spirit. I've heard people arguing that they could be vampires. And again, just in the process of looking at all of this, I tend to suspend disbelief and just, consider all the options, as it were. But they do certainly fit aspects of different types of fairy lore, fairy motifs, so that I would say I would be comfortable putting them in as a type of modern fairy or modern fairy sighting, which could change as there's more encounters being recorded and more stories coming out. But currently, for what we do have, they could fit into the wider patterns that we see with fairies in some folklore.
Yes. I mean, that's one of the things, that fairies are always depicted in exactly the same way, but, just as humans have evolved their fashions and the like and clothing, we should assume that if fairies exist, that they don't all prance about in medieval clothes, that they've also changed with the times, and nowadays would be in jeans and hoodies and sneakers.
Yes, I would expect if you were to run into one of the good folk today, out and about in the modern human world, that you probably would not initially recognize them because they would be fairly well disguised. That seems to be their thing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there is this thing, isn't there, that the fae can cast a glamour, a form of magic, so that you see them as they want to be seen, as opposed to what the reality is.
Yes. And that certainly brings up some very interesting conversations when people do have experiences. And there's sort of a long-running, at this point, debate between some corners of the fairy lore communities and some corners of the ufologist communities as to whether modern alien abductions and alien encounters are actually just fairies. Sort of, again, using that glamour to give people what they expect in a modern human world that's shaped by science fiction. That's another debate that will probably never be settled.
No, but it's a good point, because there is that sort of similarity that, if you step into a fairy ring, a fairy circle, folklore has it that you might disappear and go off to fairyland, and the time is different there, and when you get back, hours, days, years, or in some cases centuries may have elapsed. There's this sort of different time continuum. And again, you hear the same thing with some abductions, that people seem to go off and have all lots of things happen to them, but it's only a few seconds in, nobody else has noticed they've gone, or versions like that. Yeah.
Yep. There's things like that. There's, some fairy abductions are very unpleasant. Some are more pleasant. We see the same thing with stories about alien abductions. Some are traumatic, some are not. There's certain types of fairies called Marin, who they're associated with the modern English word for nightmares. But they're connected to sleep paralysis. They're said to cause sleep paralysis, which is something else that is sometimes associated with alien abductions. People will talk about experiencing sleep paralysis, being unable to move. And, definitely the time difference is a big one. Seeing lights. We have stories of fairy encounters where people follow lights in the woods or see inexplicable lights, which is something very common, of course, with UFO encounters. It's very interesting, the layers of overlap.
Yes, I mean, there's one sort of view, if you like, that the fae are evolving and taking our modern concerns and, if you like, are posing as aliens, or there's something there, or that we are encountering the same thing we've always encountered, but we, as modern day humans, are interpreting it, as you said earlier, in our
Yep. Yep, exactly. And that, like I said, that opens up a lot of really interesting conversations about what fairy experiences and fairy encounters actually are.
Yes.
And getting into that concept of glamour, of their ability to sort of manipulate human senses.
The tales have been going on for so long.
How much of any of the accounts that we have
it's not like Slender Man that nobody had ever heard of 10 years ago, if you like. But,
it's very interesting to contemplate all of it.
There's tales of encounters with something like the Fae or elves going back to Viking and Saxon and Celtic times.
Yes.
We're going back, there's tales of encounters with something like the Fae or elves going back to Viking and Saxon and Celtic times.
Yep. The oldest written account of fairies, which interestingly enough does include a kind of abduction, it goes back in writing to the 9th century in Ireland, but they have dated it, they believe, potentially to between the 5th and 7th centuries based on the language, because it's very common, of course, for the manuscripts to just be copied.
Yes.
And that would be the Extra Conla, the Adventures of Conla. So, we're looking at a minimum 1,100 years in Irish mythology, and, possibly 1,500, where we have stories of these beings coming from the other world and interacting with humans. So it's definitely deeply ingrained.
Folklore, fiction and fake lore all influence people. Should they be treated equally?
Oh, such a hot button topic. I will say that I personally am not a fan of fake lore. Although that term is a little controversial among folklorists at this point, but I think it's a bit disingenuous for people to make something up, purely invent something, and then put it out there as being older folklore, and particularly when it's intentionally ascribed to a culture that it does not come from, to sort of lend it an air of legitimacy. I have multiple sort of issues with that concept. But people do it. People have always done it. We can find fake lore going back hundreds of years. So I think whether we like it or not, we're probably stuck with it. It is one reason I encourage people to try to research concepts they find in folklore and not just perpetuate things because they find it in one source, because there is unfortunately, a lot of inaccurate information out there. Fiction is a much more complicated discussion to get into, because it really is such a strong influence in our culture, modern, Western culture broadly. And it certainly is becoming problematic in that a lot of authors do use folklore and fairy lore as a springboard for their stories. And a lot of readers don't understand that there's license being taken, that things presented are not actually folklore. And I've, in multiple instances, run across people repeating or perpetuating ideas that are from 21st century novels as if they were, Irish or Scottish fairy lore.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably a bigger issue, particularly because once it gets put out there, it's very hard to sort of put it back in the bottle, so to speak. And then it just gets passed on and on as genuine belief.
Yeah.
And, what's unfortunately resulting is that the actual older traditional folk beliefs from the source cultures are being overwritten and replaced with this sort of fictional material. Yeah. And that's not good.
Yes. The traditions going back 1,000 years have been replaced by an episode of Bewitched or
Supernatural.
Buffy. Yes, Supernatural.
Yep.
Yeah. That's always the fascinating thing with folklore, is that however far-fetched the story is, there is often some element that you can see where the story first came from, some incident or, things that were inexplicable. I mean, in the UK, there's the term fairy shot, which were the little arrowheads, the stone arrowheads, used by Neolithic man and Mesolithic man. And you can understand where the idea came from, because there were these strange, mysterious little arrows, and no one could quite understand stone arrows and where they came from. So you'd look around and that would be the source of them. Some magical people had made them, whereas with the benefit of archaeology, we know, no, they had a role and they were manufactured. But I say that's always I always find intriguing with folklore, scratch the surface to try and find where did it first come from.
Yep. The modern English term stroke for an aneurysm or cerebral accident comes from elf shot, elf stroke originally. The idea that the elves or the fairies could, with these invisible arrows, cause that particular malady among humans, that if you had a stroke, it was because you had really angered the good neighbors and, they were causing it. And, you might die from it, you might recover from it. You never knew. But because there was no understanding at the time of the physiological process involved, it just seemed like a very inexplicable, you're fine one moment, the next moment you're, whatever the consequences of that particular aneurysm happen to be, you can't speak or you're paralyzed or, what have you.
Yes.
And that was blamed very strongly on the fairies. But it's, the fact that it remains in our language today is pretty interesting.
Yes.
We've dropped the elf part of it, but the stroke part.
Yes. No, it is intriguing, that. And I say, it's just noticeable that people who you wouldn't think were believers in, I don't know, the supernatural, the paranormal, or whatever, the phrases just trip off the tongue. An elderly relative can't find something and they say the fairies must have taken it. It's just, you immediately know what it means. You don't think, oh my God, the poor woman's got fairies running around the house or something. You just know that phrase. Yes, it's disappeared somewhere, a bit like with technology, touch wood that we're still going here, gremlins are the phrase that's been accepted, and it's moved over from its early days now to all aspects of technology. There's just something that's not, you can't put your finger on it, but something's caused something to happen.
Yes, and people sort of immediately look to that supernatural or otherworldly option. Yes, and gremlins are a particularly interesting one because that's a good example of a modern type of fairy that really didn't exist prior to the First World War.
Yes.
But that, everyone's pretty much heard of them one way or another today. And perhaps, evidence that the stories and the beliefs do evolve, maybe more slowly, naturally, but they definitely do change and adapt.
Yes.
As humans do.
Indeed, yeah. And what about you? We've talked about your new book coming out, but looking through, you're a prolific author. I
have a compulsive writing problem.
I write as well, but I'm so slow and things take years to come out. I'm always impressed by authors who can complete the book as opposed to somehow get bogged down. But you what are your plans writing wise? I'm guessing with lockdown you've probably been hammering the keys more than normal.
Entertainingly enough, it actually is a bit the opposite because I have 3 children and all of them are home and all of them are terribly, terribly bored.
Right. Yes.
So it's a bit distracting. But yeah, at the moment, I'm working on a book about the other worlds, about the concept of fairy and the different stories we have across sort of Celtic language speaking cultures and into the Anglo-Saxon and a little bit of the French. Because again, it's just so fascinating, the similarities that we see as well as the differences between them. And I'm also working on a new translation of one of the sort of pivotal Irish myths, the Cath Moytura, the Battle of Moytura. So that's sort of where most of my energy is going at the moment.
Yeah, because I saw somewhere you speak and write Gaelic or Old Irish.
Yep.
I'm just looking on your Twitter. It says amateur translator of Old Irish. I would say anybody who translates Old Irish is not an amateur. That must be a fairly serious undertaking.
It is. But I really enjoy doing it. I do have some modern Irish as well, but I'm not fluent. The older Irish, I actually started doing, getting back to what we talked about sort of at the beginning of the interview, when I was first getting really into the Morrigan and learning about her. I realized, looking at some of the different translations, that they were very, very different for the same story. And I found out that a lot of the translators, particularly 100 years ago, 150 years ago, were fairly loose with their translations. They would add material, they would edit material out that didn't fit in with the sort of Victorian ethics of the time.
Yeah.
And I found it very frustrating. So I decided that I would just learn the language for myself so that I could read the myths in the original without having to rely on what a Victorian gentleman 120 years ago felt was appropriate or not to include in a story. Yeah.
Yes, that says it all, really, that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I found it very worthwhile because even really good translations, it really comes down to what the author felt was the best word to use in a certain situation. And, as with any language, if for people who speak more than one language, you'll be familiar with this. There's always nuances and layers with things that just don't carry over when they're translated. So I'm really glad that I spent the time to do that.
Mm-hmm. And what sort of time scales are those projects on?
The Otherworld project is going a bit slow at this point, again, because of the children and the other things. Yes, the Cath Moytura project, I do a section every week. And that, because it is a fairly short, relatively short manuscript, I believe I'm about 2/3 finished with it. I would expect to be finished with it probably by the end of September at the latest, the way that it's going.
Mm-hmm.
I do have a couple other smaller things that I need to work on, so hopefully that will stay on track.
Well, it's been fascinating talking to you. All I can say is thank you ever so much for taking the time to speak to us and tolerating the the good folk intervening there, cutting the link.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure to talk to you as well. Very, very good points of conversation.
You're listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian.
We haven't looked at our Weird Tales calendar recently for anniversaries of hauntings and supernatural events, so let's remedy that now with one that is said to take place every 31st of August in the nearby Suffolk town, nearby to where our studios are, that is, Suffolk town of Beccles. This is the legend of the 3 rat catchers. The story goes that during medieval times, when the town was overrun with a plague of rats, 3 local men negotiated a deal with the town's corporation and guilds that they would rid the town of its rats in exchange for a large sum of money. This they did by playing musical instruments which so enchanted the rats that they followed the men out of the town, across the marshes and down to the banks of the River Waveney, where the rats all fell into the river and drowned. But, strangely, the three men never returned to claim their payment and in fact were never seen again. Legend says the three men had sold their souls to a group of witches in exchange for the secret of enchanting rats, but, as so often happens with demonic pacts in folklore, there was a catch, and as soon as the rats had all been swept away by the waters of the river, the three men were swallowed up by the fires of hell. Their only respite for eternal damnation is once a year, on August the 31st, their ghost can be seen standing on the banks of the River Waveney, looking up at the town of Beccles. Now this is a curious legend for Suffolk, as although there is little doubt reports of towns being overrun with rats and then succumbing to outbreaks of bubonic plague such as the Black Death, which devastated East Anglia, would have lingered long in the collective memory, it also seems to share elements with the well-known, since at least the 14th century, German tale of the Pied Piper of Hamelin, where, of course, the piper leads the rats away. But there is also an unpleasant incident in the town's actual historical record, which may offer an explanation for the legend of the three burning men. It was during the reign of Queen Mary Tudor, otherwise known as Bloody Mary, when an attempt to restore Roman Catholicism as the official religion in England saw the persecution of followers of the new Protestant faith. Suffolk was not immune from the so-called Marian persecutions, and in May 1556, three local men, Thomas Spicer, John Denny and Edmund Poole, were all put to death by being burned at the stake in the old market square in Beccles. Perhaps the real-life tragedy became conflated with accounts of the Black Death and the story of the Pied Piper. Now, the origin of the giant sarsen stones at Stonehenge has finally been solved. And it wasn't aliens. The sarsens are those iconic inner circle, which is actually more of a horseshoe shape, of upright stones with equally impressive lintels. The main uprights weigh around 25 tons, and they were erected some 4,500 years ago in 2500 BC. It's long been known that the smaller blue stones, those are the stones that form the outer circle at Stonehenge, came from the Preseli Hills in Wales, but the source of the sarsens was unknown. However, progress has now been made. It turns out that over 60 years ago, in 1958, during archaeological excavations at the site, which included lifting and repositioning the lintels, a metre-long core of stone was drilled out of the top of one of the standing stones for geochemical analysis, and then lost. Yes, British boffins lost a lump of Stonehenge. Well, easy thing to do. But now it has been recovered. Hooray! Turns out it had been kept as a souvenir by one of the people involved in the 1958 work. Now aged 89, Robert Phillips decided to return it last year. Archaeologists were then able to analyse the core's chemistry and are confident it is an exact match for stone found at an outcrop of rock at Westwoods near the town of Marlborough, just 15 miles from Stonehenge. So, it was Neolithic man that carved out the stones and dragged them to the Stonehenge site, probably on wooden sleds. No alien technology was necessary. As we've often pointed out, just because we don't know exactly how ancient man did certain things, we shouldn't assume they couldn't have done it without the assistance of advanced alien technologies.
England, home to zombies, werewolves, green-skinned fairy folk? And how about dragons, strange monoliths and vampires? If you're fascinated by the bizarre and unexplained, join Charles on a road trip around the newly discovered walled Newton Triangle, where fact is much weirder than any fiction. Check out Charles Christian's fantastic Kindle book, A Travel Guide to Yorkshire's Weird Wolds, on amazon.co.uk and amazon.com.
Almost time to go, but before I let's have another look at our apocalypse bingo card of weird disasters currently blighting planet Earth and the human race. This week's disaster is the Firenado, which is like a Sharknado, except instead of being a tornado full of sharks, it's a tornado full of fire. And it's a real thing, unlike Sharknadoes, caused by extreme heat and the winds that are generated and being whipped up by them. And talking of extreme heat, the highest temperature on Earth ever, well, at least in modern times when we've been recording temperatures, was just being recorded in the Death Valley National Park in California, in a place appropriately called Furnace Creek, where the temperature on Sunday reached 54.4 degrees centigrade, which is 130 degrees Fahrenheit in old money. So add that to your list, Firenado. And really our final item. Here's a news in briefs I spotted recently. 3 young Bolivian brothers, aged 8, 10 and 12, were hospitalised after goading a black widow spider into biting them. Wait for it, in the hope that it would give them the same powers as Spider-Man. The boys had found the poisonous spider while out herding their father's goats. It would have been particularly weird if they'd been herding his ghost, and had prodded it with a stick until it bit each of them in turn. They were subsequently admitted to hospital with fevers, tremors and muscle pains, but made a full recovery and were discharged a week later. In case you were wondering, the experience did not give them any superpowers or spidey senses. I'm just glad there were no black widow spiders living anywhere near me when I was a kid, or else I'd have been there trying to do the same stunt. Mind you, my father didn't have any goats to herd. Now it just remains for me to say this is Charles Christian saying thank you so much for listening, and please join me again same time next week for more weird tales for the weird times we're living in. Until then, stay well, stay weird, stay different.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic and folklore. You can keep in touch with us online at www.weirdtalesradio.com, by email to weirdtales@icloud.com, and on Twitter @ChristianUncut. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Good night.